Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name is Ralph Cree. This is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. In this episode, I speak with Ben Williams, who is a scholar and practitioner of Tantra, and he teaches at Naropa University in America. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's about awakening, and I won't say much more, just get into it. So, Ben Williams, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Yeah, you too. So we were broadly going to talk about the relationship between Shiva and Shakti in classical Indian Tantra. But before we launch into that, please could you say just a little bit about who you are, in relation to this work, just so people can get an idea, feel for who you are, please. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So currently I'm an assistant professor of Hinduism and yoga studies at Naropa University. And Naropa is a liberal arts college that's Buddhist inspired, and it's based in Boulder, Colorado. And I have a PhD in Indian philosophy and Indian religions. I did a master's in Hindu studies before that, and a BA in religious studies. And so, broadly speaking, my area of expertise is the history of religions in South Asia. More specifically, I focused in my doctoral research on Tantric traditions, or the history of Shaivism, or Tantric forms of Shaivism. And that includes traditions that are dedicated or center on goddesses, so Shakti traditions. And I specifically focused on Abhinavagupta, who is a pretty well-known within people who are aware of these traditions, philosopher, literary theorist, and kind of tantric master. Beyond that, I do have a background of being a part of community in which some of the teachings of the traditions that I study are practiced and are part of the kind of culture and philosophy of the community. So I do have that kind of side to me as a scholar practitioner. And that definitely informs my work and my understanding. And I think that's a short version.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I think being a scholar / practitioner is a really great thing, because you've got this kind of dual perspective from the inside and the outside of a tradition, and one without the other can become a little lopsided. So if one was only a scholar, then you're sort of studying something from the outside and not necessarily having the first person experiences that you're describing or researching. Whereas if one was just a practitioner, then you find it difficult to get outside of your tradition and think critically about it. And you can end up with a bit of groupthink or sort of literal practicing without questioning it. And you can get some kind of ossified traditional stuff that you just keep doing and no one understands why they're doing it, because people haven't stepped outside to look at it. So, I think a scholar practitioner's, what a wonderful thing. And I think it's relatively rare to meet people or encounter people that have got they've gone deep in both of those routes, which, as far as I understand from what I've learned about you in preparation for this talk, you've done both of those things.
I've tried to, that's definitely been the spirit of my approach to developing in both of those realms. I have noticed sometimes there's a leaning one way or the other, even for people who are, aspiring to be scholar practitioners, that really sometimes one of those paradigms kind of is dominant, so to speak. And I just want to have a little humility. It's really, I agree, it's brilliant, it's important work. And it's really difficult to find a balance, and to find a creative, dynamic balance where it's not slightly lopsided. Yeah. And there's something there. I sense an incredible potential in that, in terms of reimagining tradition, actually, which we could go into a little if you'd like. But
yeah. Well, that's like actually one of the last questions I wanted to ask was, we could just kind of put a flag in it for later, is how has Tantra evolved since its beginnings 1500 years ago, roughly? It would be, because this my podcast is about how spiritual practice is evolving and has evolved, and embracing that, and that been a good thing. And so the one thing I think we ought to do at the beginning, because when I talk to people about Tantra and tantric practice, they always think that I'm talking about sex, and I thought we'd just get the sex talk out of the way. That there's this thing called neo-tantra. It's kind of classical tantra, neo-tantra, and neo-tantra sort of owes its origins to people like Osho and Adidar, and probably people before that, sort of 60s and onwards. And a lot of it is sexual practices, and in classical tantra, my understanding of it is that there were some sexual practices, but it's a very small part of an enormous tradition, that most of it is not really to do with sex. But nowadays, if you mention tantra, people always think you're talking about sexual practices. And just the last thing to say about that is that the neo-tantra is just a distinct thing. It's sort of become its own new religious movement kind of thing, a little bit like Hare Krishnas or something like that, kind of spawned out of the Hindu tradition. And that as in its own, it's its own thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But confusing that with the kind of tantra that we're going to be talking about isn't helpful. And a lot of tantric sexual practices I very much enjoy myself. So it's not, I'm not. I think people that are into classical tantra can kind of poo-poo the neo-tantra a little bit, and I don't necessarily want to do that here, but just to make those distinctions.
Yeah, very clear summary. I think that's a really important thing to not conflate. And it's partly because the colloquial meaning of Tantra for most people is sacred sexuality, and the types of movements and communities that are engaged in that, and the types of narratives that surround that as well, in terms of a kind of liberation from one's own sexual oppression tied to whatever we've received in our notions around sexuality. And I think that classical tantra is a completely different beast. And so often this creates a smokescreen, and it doesn't allow us to appreciate classical tantra. And so I actually describe it in my Hindu tantra class as like a pink smokescreen. Right? It's like you hear the word tantra, and it's suddenly like all you can see is sexuality, right?
Writhing pink.
We want to be able to say, okay, we're talking about something different than that, And then the second move I do, which is very similar to what you do, is say, well, no, and Neo-Tantra is its own tradition, and it has its own integrity, it has its own history, and it has its own, virtues potentially, and also, there's some really scary liabilities that have played out as well. And so being really open-eyed about all of that. But it's, and I feel this way about a lot of traditions, even a lot of New Age spirituality. They didn't come out of nowhere. And even though they're sometimes involve romanticization and projection and that kind of thing, and cause like conflations or this inability to make important distinctions, that kind of orientation, that perennialist spiritual orientation, has its own history and integrity, and is worth studying in its own regard, and appreciating in its own regard. And scholars like Jeffrey Kripal's work is, for me, kind of a really good way of thinking through that. So
Jeff
forms of religiosity, yeah.
Jeff Kripal comes up a lot, and I really need to check out more of his stuff. I have listened to a couple of interviews he did, and I really liked it. The other thing I wanted to just sort of, that you asked if you could just say something a little bit about how Tantra kind of pushed off from some of the traditions that were around at the time, that were, I think, and the reason why I'm interested in this is I think in my own practice, kind of went down a little bit down the Vedanta wormhole, and a little bit of the, and a lot of the kind of Buddhist tradition as well. These are all very large fields. So, Buddhism is huge, and so is Vedanta, but there's quite a prevalent mood in there, which is kind of world negating. So it's kind of privileging emptiness over form, perhaps, or you might, if we were to talk about this in Shiva Shakti terms, privileging Shiva and that empty formless I amness over over the world of form, and that it's a slightly kind of world negating view. And in my own practice, that kind of like dried up after a while and lost it was really exciting to begin with, but then I started to feel a little bit dead, honestly. And so Tantra seems to be like very much world affirming. So Abhinava Gupta, who you've mentioned, was into loads of different things, really, and him being the sort of central figure in classical Tantra, that was really embraced everything in life, was just in living life to the full, but with the very, very clear understanding of Shiva and emptiness, at the same time. So it's, could you do better than me, perhaps, in describing how it pushed off from the religious mood of the time?
Yeah, sure. So the interesting thing about Tantra, classical Tantra, is that it's a complex, it's a kind of turn that happens within multiple traditions and multiple religions. So you have a turn that happens within Buddhism, a tantric turn. You have a turn that happens within the early Śaiva religion, which is, a religion devoted to the deity Shiva. And similarly, you have a turn in Jainism. And so you have this tantric turn. And each inflection of that turn is distinctive to the horizon, the kind of the milieu, right? That tradition is in, and the kind of backward horizon, its own history. So Mahayana Buddhists who go through this turn are looking back, or like the fledgling Buddhist tantrikas are looking back on Mahayana Buddhism, and they're looking back on Theravada Buddhism. The fledgling Shaiva tantrikas are looking back on Patanjali, Sankhya, Vedanta, the Upanishads, and the Vedic religion, in the Dharma literature. That's their horizon. And the Jains are looking back on the earlier Jain scriptures and the earlier Jain ascetic traditions. And so each one of them is responding to a different background. And, but there is this pattern, I think, which you're describing, which is, although there are ascetics within tantric traditions, one of the distinctions is it's not primarily an ascetic tradition. Even from the beginning, it's clear, after the very earliest roots, that this is a way of religious life that one is initiated into, that is open to householders. And so part of it is you could track this sociologically, and then you can track this cosmologically as well. Like, what's the nature of the world, and how does that relate to practice? But so when you say pushing against, there's a lot of things that are pushing, these new traditions are pushing against, or pushing back on. And one of them is a more a transcendent model and a certain anxieties you can see in earlier monastic traditions around things like desire and all these other elements of human life, the body, right? Embodiment, the role of the mind. A lot of these traditions are about, they're cessative, to use a nice term, right? There's a nice distinction between cessative forms of meditation and numinous, right? And so I can go more into...
Could you just unpack the cessative? So does that mean as in cessation?
As in cessation.
Nirvikalpa type thing?
Yeah, like if you look, for example, at the logic of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the goal is ultimately cessation of, one's being embedded or identified with the manifest world of mind and matter. And so Nirodha means cessation. That's really what the goal is. It's a cessative path. And early...
That's a term that crops up a lot in Buddhist literature. That's the type of Buddhist literature that's very commonly read in the West nowadays. Cessation, crops up.
Yeah. And nirvana means extinction as well. Yeah. Similar connotation. And we find in the Pali Canon the same word nirodha that Patanjali is using. And so it's, you could say it's a part of a deeper spiritual logic, which is about going beyond, right? All form, to use the way you were describing it earlier. And of course, what one dissolves into is going to be distinct across different traditions and how that's conceived. But that really is kind of an end point, right? That's the culmination of the path. And numinous, this is a distinction that Stuart Sarbacher uses in his book, the cessative, the numinous and the cessative. Samadhi is the name title of the book. It's a really good framework. The numinous has to do with a whole nother body of things that we find in pre-tantric traditions. Like in the Buddhist literature, there's descriptions of at the final stages of the arupya jhanas, so like the formless meditations, or dhyanas in Sanskrit, or jhana in Pali, you have the arising of all these powers, like the ability to recall your past lives, right? Or the ability to know the minds of other beings, or the ability to become very small or to be very heavy. These are all, or exquisite experiences of radiance or unending, capacity to know, or omniscience, right? All of these are numinous experiences. And the Buddha will say, in a lot of different contexts, it's like, don't get stuck here, right? This is a penultimate, this is a non-ultimate set of experiences. But nonetheless, they include them, and they all recognize that they're a part of the path, whether they're a part of the goal or they're just byproducts, right, of a deeper process of liberation. But you find, for example, in the Mahabharata, this idea of becoming a godlike yogi and having like this bala, this like power, and being able to actually, the Mahabharata describes being able to inhabit multiple bodies at the same time and control them all with one will. And so,
like that blue guy in Watchmen.
Yeah,
exactly. Like Dr. Manhattan, was that his name?
I think so. I haven't been tracking Watchmen as closely.
Okay.
I like the Marvel universe a little more, but
yeah, it's just I just watched the one movie.
Yeah. Oh, nice, yeah. So, you could say that these are more about this worldly power in different ways, and they have a numinous quality, right? They're like awesome and radiant and like imminent. Like all of these features are part of this modality of awakening. And Tantra just takes that, and runs with it. And in fact, early Tantras they don't care so much about liberation. They're like, that's lesser, right? It's actually about empowerment. And then, of course, by the time of Abhinavagupta, the tradition's more developed. Liberation is recentered, and those are, but still, there's a shift in notion of what liberation is. And this kind of comes maybe to the point as well, specifically the emergence of this idea, which we also actually see arise in Vedanta, of Jivan Mukti, or liberation while being embodied or while living, right? And so it's not some post-mortem state, right, that only happens when the body falls away, or and then in tantric traditions, there's also, specifically in these traditions called the Kaula traditions, there's this there's a kind of oscillation between transcendence and transmutation that's quite beautiful. Meaning, and I think you see this as well in Tantric Buddhism, you do need to disembed from limited identifications. That move of being able to make your previous locus of identity an object of awareness and disembed from that, to kind of let go of that as the ceiling of your identity, is still a really important part of tantric traditions, right? Which you see in these transcendently oriented tradition, earlier traditions. But then it doesn't end with this like final resting in the transcendent reality. There's then another movement. And Alexis Sanderson describes this really eloquently as the pervasion of the transcended, meaning all of the structures that have been transcended are suddenly flooded with that reality. It kind of pours through them and transmutes them into itself. And here we find a lot of alchemical metaphors, actually, in the tradition that are quite exquisite. And so it's like you still have all of the shape and form of, and reality and tangibility and beauty and maybe even tragedy and intensity of life, but it's suddenly shining in a completely new light that's kind of flooded one's perspective. And that being the final movement, right? It's actually about that process. It's not about an exit strategy.
Yeah.
And that's, that's quite exquisite. That was a very wending.
Yeah, no, it's good. So that in a way that laid out the path of the way I wanted to go with the rest of our conversation. That you've got these kind of polarities of the transcending and the immanent, or maybe we might call it the numinous, transcending and the numinous. Yeah, we're happy to go with that.
Yeah,
there's so many different terms we could use, but
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, let's say, so if you could say, well, yeah, those two poles. I love the one. So one of the things I and to correct me if I'm wrong here, love when I first encountered this sort of tantric view of kind of looking at the experience as this kind of grand polarity of transcendence and immanence, or emptiness and form, Shiva and Shakti. That it's like you kind of reduce everything down to these two interacting poles that are always in some dynamic relationship and never quite collapsed into one, but at the same time there is this kind of third move where they become become one. I mean, it's very difficult to describe in words, and we'll get to. So I wanted to sort of go from a third person perspective to a second person perspective to the first person perspective in this way, but That sort of mysteriously, Shiva and Shakti, although being distinct poles and almost polar opposites, are also one at the same time. And you know, the kind of nearest thing I've come to it conceptually that you can think of it outside in a kind of slightly third person way is a Mobius strip. Do you know the Mobius strip? Is so for people listening or watching, it's like, imagine a loop of tape, imagine cutting it, doing a half turn and then sticking it back together. It actually is a one-sided shape. You can run your finger along the surface until you meet the same place where you let with your finger. So it looks like it's two-sided, but it's actually one-sided. It has no other side to it. And tantric. The reason why I wanted to explore these sort of three perspectives on Shiva and Shakti, and we ought to get into defining exactly what Shiva and Shakti are in a minute, is that Tantra seems to be very playfully moves around these three perspectives. It's quite a liminal tradition that it's sort of 1 minute you're talking about these deities in the third person. And then the next minute you're kind of doing a deity practice where you're in relationship with them, and then the next minute you're actually becoming those deities, and your entire identity is made up of them, and they are in relationship inside you, but then you are them in relationship, but then you're also one totality. So it's kind of, it really I think it's a little bit hard. There's a slipperiness to it because it kind of moves around these perspectives so freely and unashamedly, which makes it a little bit hard to tie down. But yeah, so I don't even know where I started or where I ended with that. But is there anything you wanted to say about any of that I just said?
Yeah, I think just like a very small caveat that when we speak about classical Tantra, and we're speaking about Shiva and Shakti and this dynamic relationship you're describing, of kind of unity and polarity and dialogical unity or something, that really we're speaking about non-dual Shaiva Tantra, and which becomes philosophized in this tradition called pratyabhijna, recognition. There's a whole, it's a small caveat, but it's important that there's a whole Shaiva tantric tradition that's dualistic, that doesn't even, where the goddess is like invisible. Shakti is like minimalized, and it's really Sadashiva at the center. And that's called Shaiva Siddhanta. And that's actually a very important tantric tradition in Indian history. In fact, one that was more well established socially and politically than non-dual Shaiva Tantra. So non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Shiva Shakti.
Yeah.
So Shiva is sometimes identified as Prakasha, the light of consciousness, the light of manifestation, and Shakti as Vimarsha, which is that consciousness's ability to be aware of itself, a self-reflexive awareness. And that happens through the dynamism of action and knowing, cognition and action, not of an individual cognition and act as such, but as the kind of motive power of that sustains every single cognitive act in the action of creating the whole universe, which does arise freely in the gesture of play. I think you kind of touched on this idea of playfully, right?
Yeah.
Meaning there's no compulsion for this universe to manifest. It's literally just the complete liberated expression of play. It doesn't have a particular end in mind. It's not instrumentalizing, it's not goal-oriented, right? It's just like literally just doing it for its own sake as a natural expression, like when someone dances, right? Or when someone creates art or music, right? So Shakti is the power, the energy, the dynamism, any place where you have, and that becomes form, right? That kind of condenses down into form, but is also the very substance of, like, any kind of movement or time or, imagination or activity. And okay, so you have on the surface then a kind of polarity between.
So Shakti is a goddess or the goddess?
Well, there's many goddesses, and which are forms like that could be worshipped, that are expressions of Shakti. In this non-dual Śaiva view, it's the goddess, not a goddess. It's the goddess energy. And in fact, one being amongst many is not what we're talking about. We're talking about like the energy behind all beings, from the most rarefied divine being to the most mundane. So in Shiva, similarly, is not just a deity amongst many, right? It's in this non-dual philosophy, the very conception of deity is radically revised. In the earlier traditions, you have an idea of deity separate from the universe, separate from self, right? That one propitiates. In these traditions, the deity is the panentheistic reality. That is the core of consciousness that animates everything, right? That is the self of all beings. And that is the very substance of this universe. It's technically speaking, the material and the instrumental cause of the universe. And to speak about that, right? They use these two aspects, right? Because there is a reality to the deity that transcends this universe as well. That's why it's panentheistic. And so, it's almost Shiva and Shakti. As soon as you hear those words, it's like Tantra, right? You see someone with snakes around their neck and blue skin. You see, Shakti, you see all these different forms, right? That's not what these philosophers are talking about. They're actually making a comprehensive theological argument for the very nature of reality, right? And they're using these terms technically, not to refer to, anthropomorphic deities that have myths related to them. Of course, they're aware of those myths and they draw on that imagery and that symbolism, and that enriches the tradition in a very beautiful way. But Shiva and Shakti is like consciousness and its power to create,
So that would be, that last statement there is the first person experience, the first person singular experience of there is no other.
Yes.
And so you're kind of there's this kind of yes, it's why it gets difficult with this non-dual stuff, that we've got, as you say, you might be reading a non-dual tantric text and they're kind of pulling in this imagery from these mythic deities and gods and goddesses and stuff, as you said, using them to illustrate and their points, and drawing on the metaphors that and cultural history of that people will understand, to make a point. But it can be a bit confusing when you're reading these tantric texts, when you don't understand that. Like, the way you've articulated there is really helpful. And that's what I mean slightly by this kind of liminality of the tradition, that they'll kind of use whatever they need to because what they're really interested in is you and me and anybody else realizing who we are, that we are that. And I think one of the things that is great about the tantric tradition, one of the things I love about is it really seeks to harmonize these three perspectives, that in the view is something that's brought up a lot in Tantra, has been very important. That being this kind of third person philosophy, or the theological explorations, and they take that really seriously. And then also you do deity yoga, which might be more of a sort of second person practice where you are visualizing Shiva or Shakti. Well, I mean, that's something I would love you to explore a bit more, that actual deity process. But then, it kind of culminates in you being that deity, those deities. And the bit that I'd love you to kind of unpack a bit is how they become one in some sort of supreme being at this, which that's a bit like that Buddhist statement in the Heart Sutra that emptiness is form and form is emptiness. That just like, you can never wrap your mind around it, but as a first person experience, it's just a simple fact. And so if you could please just say a bit about deity yoga as done in the non-dual tantric way, if that's possible, please.
Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe describe, run us through what a practice session might be like where you do that.
Sure. There's a couple of registers to how deities, how one establishes a second person relationship to a deity. And it's all founded on an initial identification with the deity, even if you're kind of doing a dualistic, ritualistic worship of the deity. There's this really important dictum, Shiva Bhutva Shivam Yajeta, having become Shiva, worship Shiva. So there's an initial identification with Shiva, and it's seen as a purifying and empowering identification. And I can share a little bit about this. It's called the Nithya karma, the daily ritual that a tantric initiate would do. And of course, this ritual is actually really quite exquisite, and it's centered on tantric worship of the deity. But in the kind of more and more esoteric traditions, it's less ritualistic, and there's like quicker, more efficient ways of communing with deity self. But nonetheless, I think it's an important kind of structure. So first you would systematically identify with the deity, and this involves a practice called nyasa, which is the deposition or installation of mantras. And so you actually touch your body and you say different mantras for different parts of the body. And those mantras correspond to the body of the deity. There's this idea in Śaiva Tantra of mantra devata, mantra deities, meaning they're composed of these like really subtle, potent sounds called mantras. And so by touching your body and infusing the body of the deity where your body is, you're actually transforming your body into a mantra body. And that's a kind of body that the deity can then enter. And so that initial entrance is this really powerful, you begin with a merger or an identification with the deity. And there's a bunch of other processes of visualization that happen. You imagine, like flooding the body with nectar. You use different mantras to dissolve your previous understanding of the body or your image of the body, and make space for this new mantric body. This is all called antaryaga, internal worship, worshiping the deity as self in an embodied way. And then it's followed by bahiryaga, where you worship the deity by projecting it into some medium. And it might be a mandala, a deity installing diagram. There's a number of different mediums that one could install the deity in. And then you worship the deity externally after first doing it internally. And so it's a very second person thing, right? You install the deity with these mantras for the different parts of the deity's body. You make offerings of liquid and flowers and incense. You're using mantra the whole time. You're using visualization and your own prana fused with mantras to install the deity. This is for initiates only, usually, right? This is once you've been initiated into the tantric lineage. And then you end with stotras, singing the praises of the deity, and beautiful hymns, and japa, repetition of the mantra. That's a basic structure we see across many different tantric rituals. And then there's different inflections if you're aiming for certain siddhis or karmas, like rituals for trying to achieve certain goals or aims. And the part where you're worshiping the deity externally should be, dripping with devotion. It really is this like deity as other, deity as thou, right? There's all these ways you're addressing the deity, and it follows a basic structure you also see in the Vedas of like welcoming a guest and entertaining a guest, actually, like washing their feet, would you like some chai and parle ji, or whatever. Okay, now the other place where this comes up, this dialectic, is in devotional hymns, which we see in the Tantric tradition. We see these exquisite devotional hymns, and there you call out to the deity in vocative forms like, oh Shambhu, right, Shambho, or oh Bhairava, or oh Devi, right? And you invoke, there's all these hymns that play, like Utpaladeva, Abhinavagupta's Grand Guru, has all, Grand Guru, has all of these like ways in which he's playing with the idea that I'm praising you, but you're not separate from me. Right? It's like you're separate and you're not separate at the same time. And he's puns on that, like he has all these kind of wordplay on that. It's almost like they're aware that the very structure of praise, stuti or stotra, is dualistic. And they're aware of that. And yet instead of shying away from it, they embrace it, right? They embrace the conversational nature of this, right? They embrace the relational aspect because they don't want a non-duality that's going to get rid of relationship.
I think one of the things that makes me think is that that like one might imagine a kind of a finality in the non-dual experience that the tantrics don't want. That they don't want an end to this. It's so sublime that and exciting, and I mean and just this kind of unfathomable journey, that to want to kind of close it down. They don't want to close it down, so they have to keep this kind of like you're saying, like, and it's a little bit of a joke because you're doing it. It's a little bit like but you're sort of doing it on purpose so that you don't close things down by
exactly. Yeah, I like that. That's definitely within the spirit of these texts. Having read them now in the original language for 12 years and studied them for a long time before that, that's definitely true to the spirit of these texts for sure. And one text in particular you might want to check out is the Parachishika Vivarna, because it takes up this issue of the pronouns, and specifically first person and then the goddess, because it's a dialogue between Devi or Bhairavi and Bhairava. And she's asking him these questions, and she's doing it because she wants to be illuminated by this knowledge. And of course, we're all listening in. It's like the way that these tantras are structured. It's like they're having a conversation, but it's really for us. It's like there's a part of this broader audience, right? Even like with the idea, like once it was heard in the Buddhist tradition, right? And they tell a story of the Buddha speaking with someone. We're all a part of that audience, right? It's this expanding audience. And Abhinavagupta raised this question about how is it that the goddess is ignorant, and where is she speaking from, and how is it, if she's one with Shiva, how is it that she's taken this relationship, right, of questioner and answer, this kind of second person relationship, and then what's the third person? And basically it's exquisite. And I could say more about the first person too, as the fusion of Shiva and Shakti, but you can bookmark that. But basically he says that, you know, this dialogical, it represents a phase within the unfurling of the universe, and also a phase within the awakening. Those are twin movements, right? The unfurling or the creative process is a twin movement to the awakening or the recognition process, right? Just going in different directions. Right. So there's this phase, which is called para, or it can be translated as unity and diversity, or like diversifying unity. And so there's this level of the goddess where she's speaking to him, and they're experiencing the polarity, but they're also experiencing the unity at the same time. And that unity is never broken. And then when you go to the third person, that's where like it really does, like a more congealed duality comes into place, right? And there really is a sense of being separate. But at this phase of like intimacy, there's actually unity and diversity, para. And Alexis Anderson describes this particular phase, or this, and this corresponds to a goddess in the Trika tradition as well, as, or Bheda is the Sanskrit term for this, which means something like unity and diversity, where it allows for what we're talking about, which is like the full luminous immanence of the manifest world, with a kind of threading through it of a sense of unity, right? And a resting in unity while enjoying and experiencing and relishing and savoring this whole life experience. And he describes it as aesthetic, Sanderson, when he talks about this level. There's like an aesthetic dimension. It's like the aesthetic, because of that unity that threads through everything, one is able to experience the duality as like an adornment, right? It's something that adds beauty to the universe. It's not something to be completely destroyed or wiped out, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah, it
so,
reminds me of that kind of Tibetan Buddhist iconography of sort of, you know, the adornments that those empty deities wear. You know, they sort of have deities that are literally empty deities, but they wear this sort of clothing that's all floating, and, you know.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. That's an exquisite image. Yeah. I think that's a kind of, in a Buddhist aesthetic flavor, that would be one way of portraying this. And in a more of a kind of non-dual Śaiva, it might be like adornments on the fullness. But
okay, yeah, sure, yeah. Well, so
overflowing flood of, you know.
one thing I'd love to hear you unpack is, so there's a view of, let's say, formless consciousness, or we might use Shiva in this context if you'd allow it, but do put in some caveats if you need to. Being a kind of passive HQ that receives in the kind of Western scientific model, you've got kind of naked consciousness, just sort of is this HQ that receives sensory data. So it's like there'd be a little bit like Shakti flows to this central point. But I was reading Christopher Wallace's, but it might have been the Recognition Sutras, or his Tantra Illuminated, or is it Illumined? But both great books, love them. But he was saying how in this non-dual tantric view, the consciousness of Shiva extends outwards to touch objects. So like flows outwards rather than being this kind of passive point that receives everything in towards it, if that makes sense. And I may have misunderstood what I read, but it was like when I read that, I suddenly thought I just lived with the assumption that information flows towards this kind of central point rather than the other way around, that this kind of emptiness flows, actually can move outwards, extends and touches things. And it was just a complete 180 flip on the way I'd spent my entire life thinking about the relationship of consciousness and information. And I may have got it totally wrong, but, which is why I wanted to bring it up with you.
Yeah, happy to speak about that. I think there's a little nuance. There's a lot of nuances here that make it are places where I think it gets really interesting. And there's these Shakti traditions where they see the goddess as higher than Shiva, like the Krama tradition that's you may have heard of. It's centered around this teaching and for Abhinavagupta around 12 Kalis and Kalas and Karshini. And then the Trika tradition, this other goddess tradition. And I think those are interesting pieces to this topic. But I will say to try to address your question that, Shiva is, again, if we think about, well, what are the kind of mythological roots that are now informing this understanding of the nature of consciousness? One is that Shiva is a creator deity, meaning the universe flows out of this deity, right? And in the more mythological Pauranika, Shiva doesn't necessarily, it's not his being that becomes the universe. It's rather some other stuff, Mahaprakriti or Maya or something that he's using to make the universe, right? But once you get into this non-dual realm and Shiva is no longer personified, but is now consciousness itself, there's still this nature of Shiva as creator, meaning everything is pouring out of this consciousness, like emerging from it like a heart, like the heart. It's the center and core of all phenomena, right? And so that might be something of this idea of which is becoming everything and touching itself, really. Vimarsha, I mean, it's really the Shakti that is the dynamic part that's touching. Vimarsha, this idea of the self-awareness, which is all action and all agency, is described as Vimarsha, and Vimrush means actually to touch. One of the meanings is to touch. And there's a way in which it's this beautiful, there's this kind of sensation, right? This way in which this consciousness is touching itself, right? And embracing itself. And
can I just interject there with when I heard about the Consciousness Mudra, which is where you touch your forefinger to your thumb, and that is just beautiful. When I came across that, when I heard that, I was like, wow, that's kind of in the same kind of thing as what you're talking about.
Yeah. That's a beautiful symbol of what we're talking about, that touch. Like you said earlier, if there's only Shiva and Shakti really in this kind of infinite play between them, then it's consciousness exploring itself ad infinitum, right? We are just that process, right? We've identified with a fragment of it, right? We've identified with one just small part of this much deeper process that we're all part of. And part of it is shifting the locus of our identity from that fragment to the core of that process. That shift in that identity to the core of that process means we just see our own minds and all things, right, as just another instance of consciousness touching itself, right? Knowing itself, engaging itself, right? Exploring itself. But it's blooming infinitely. And so, even in the recognition sutras, right, the difference, you're using the immanence of the movements of your own mind, the way your mind is creating a microcosm of experience, right? The way a thought literally births and creates a world of experience, sustains it, and then dissolves. And so by seeing that process, by seeing the flow of the mind as Chitti Shakti, right? Not just as my mind, or right, but as literally a kind of crystallization, or palpitation of this deeper fluttering of this whole universal consciousness universe project, right? Then that itself becomes the shift. It no longer is taking consciousness and exclusively wrapping it around one set of experience, and then that being like focused on the content, right? And everything that comes out of that, like the whole conceptual mind, the whole life story, right? It's actually saying, no, all of that is the shimmering of this Chitti Shakti, as consciousness, Shiva, is experiencing himself in and through his Shakti, right? And he can see himself through her. It's like she's like a mirror, right?
Yeah, it makes me think like for Shiva, or to experience himself, he needs to have this other come out, the Shakti, because there's a kind of there is the recognition of being conscious, awake, that I am, is kind of inherently satisfying, and almost infinitely intriguing. Like it's the gift that keeps on giving. But at the same time, there, and this is just in my own experience, I've found that there's something else that wants to come out. That there's this desire for more, and that's a kind of move where, slightly departing from this Nirod, pure transcendentalist traditions, which is still really, really prevalent, around the world and in the West, and that this I just kind of lost it there, but to kind of expand the possibility of experiencing oneself, needs to have this outflowing. And then so I mean, it's confusing because we're jumping around between first, second, and third person, and deities, and non-dual, and there is no other than you, and all this kind of thing, and it's all already. But so in that, it's kind of so Shakti kind of like flows out of Shiva to increase the possibilities of experience or something, or to increase the I don't know. I mean, it's
well, one way of trying to navigate it is talking about the union of Shiva and Shakti, which you were
So I mean, that is a great mystery, how that experience is a singular thing. The fact of your direct experience is a single moment, or a single totality. It's just a fact, and nothing fancy. Just the bare fact, experiencing being you right now is a singular thing. But at the same time, you can notice your awakeness being slightly distinct from the forms, but they're never separate. You never get one without the other. And even in those kind of Nirod or very, very deep emptiness experiences, I do wonder whether people are genuinely having an experience of nothingness, because or it's just very, 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 very subtle Shakti that has been experienced. And it's just like, you can kind of talk about it as if, in deep dreamless sleep, there's just nothingness. But really, like, I mean, I don't know.
That's really interesting. Okay, I think one way of appreciating that in the non-dual Śaiva view, which is very subtle. And I think it's, appreciate, our listeners attempt to stay with us it's very difficult to translate this into simple terms, but there is also an elegance to it. So there's this text called the Bodha Vilasa, which I actually translated with Christopher Wallace, and I think he shared it with his community. It's by this tantric master named Hrasvanata, who lived, we actually can date him to between 900 and 950 CE. And it has another name called the Dvaya Sampati Vartika, which means this kind of commentary on these verses from the Vijnana Bhairava. There's this pair of verses, but it also means really the Dvaya Sampati is like the kind of attainment of the two, the Dvaya. And the two are Shiva and Shakti. But the way that they're presented is based on this really beautiful esoteric teaching that the letter A is Shiva, and the phoneme A, and the letter Ha or Hum is Shakti. And the first person pronoun in Sanskrit language is aham. Okay. And so they're playing on this, but there's also codes between what A and Ha refer to. A refers to anuttara, which means the unsurpassable or the ultimate reality. And it's kind of like what we've been talking about. It's that which is akula. It's not the immanent, it's the transcendent, right? Kula means the embodiment, or like the kind of immanent world. And akula means that which it completely transcends that. And Ha stands for visarga, which is a really important term. It means the emanation, or the emission, or the creative flux or flow of the universe. It also means, interesting, ejaculation. And there is some sexual imagery in the background here of this yamala, this union. And they use terms that have this, and there's like frictive union between these two realities, right? And if we talk about the transcendent paths that you've been referring to in that orientation, it's like they're just going for the right? But it's not the whole I. It's just the part. It's not the aham, right? The full I has to include, for these Shaivas, the totality of the cosmos and everything in it, right? And so this idea
that would be, if we were to say that in the English phrase, I am, that's the am part. Yeah. Am I forcing the parallel?
Yes, there? But the question is, what does the am refer to? And how far does this I extend, right? Is it an I that's just untouched by all phenomena, right? Or is it an I that somehow includes and embraces, right? And enfolds all everything, right? The whole immanent universe. And it's the latter, right? And this is why they call it Purnaham Ta. Purnahan Ta is this really important term. And Purna means fullness, or completeness. But it's translated as all-encompassing or all-embracing by Alexis Anderson for this very important reason, because it's a sense of I that's not outside or beyond the universe. It's a sense of I in which this entire universe is arising, right? It's an all-encompassing I. So it's seeing the fullness of everything we're experiencing in this world as arising within this I, right? And that's the fusion of and hum, right? That's the fusion of anuttara, the ultimate, and visarga, the kind of dynamism of the whole creative process, into a single reality, paradoxically, right? And yet somehow just the simple fact, as you're saying, right? Just the simple fact of what it is. Is that helpful?
Yeah. I think when we're talking about it in the sort of philosophical sense or third person sense, you're just left with paradox and this kind of unsolvable equation that will not collapse down. But in your first person experience, it's a simple fact. You don't need to do anything to make it what it is. One of the things I'd heard you say in an interview before, which I really liked, was, and this made me think that it's so important to think carefully about what words we're using. So you hear a lot of people say free from. So, freedom is being free from something. And, you might say enlightenment is freedom from everything. But I've heard you say free for, which I thought was great, was brilliant. And that there's a kind of, there's a really nice distinction there. And I think it relates to what you're saying there, that to be free for all of, so Shiva is free for Shakti in a way, or the reverse, Shakti is free for Shiva. And it's this kind of generative statement. It's a generative word or terminology. Rather than a kind of like retreating type of movement.
That comes from this book that was written by Alex Watson, who's actually a British scholar of Śaiva philosophy, and Dominic Goodall and Anjaneya Sharma. It's a translation, critical edition and translation of the Paramoksha Nirasakarika, which is the definition of moksha according to the other traditions. And it's a fascinating Sanskrit work, which presents 20 views of moksha and then refutes them all. And then says, okay, this is the true meaning of moksha. But it gives this incredible spectrum of different views on moksha. And in the introduction, Alex Watson uses this rubric of freedom from or freedom for. And you can see in different models of moksha that they are one or the other. I mean, freedom pretty much threads all of them. It could be as basic as freedom from suffering, right? One of the most basic understandings of moksha is dukkanta, like the end of dukkha, right? But yeah, freedom is not.
Then I think of Jesus was free for suffering, in a way, as an archetype,
Yeah, exactly, not free of suffering. But
he was free for it, free in it.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds like we both appreciate that, and sounds like we both also have had tastes and exposures to, or I can share with you that I have, I've had that more transcendent impulse be really at the core of my spiritual life. And I've felt the subtle pain of that, or the fragmentation of that. And
it's interesting because I love the way you say it's painful, because honestly, that was my experience too. But one wouldn't think that would, when you're kind of like floating off, the pain would be an issue, would even be a factor.
Or maybe like, another word is like numbing or something, Yeah. But no, exactly. It's not like pain in any normal sense, and it's not like numbness in any normal sense either. It's like a kind of numbness of the soul or something, and I think I still have the reason I say all of that is because I still have a really deep, healthy respect for those traditions and for that impulse. And, I think ultimately it's not a great final destination, but nonetheless, it is real. And, we were talking about, like, was some subtle Shakti or some immanence? Like, sometimes I think there is actually a reality, a dimension of reality, where it is utterly beyond all form forever, all the time, like there's no subtle like manifestation there at all. I mean, that's just from my own depths of experience and study of the tradition. Like I have that sense a little, and I also feel that it's missing this piece, which in some senses, it's missing the immanence, it's missing the creativity, and it's missing the life process. And that stuff, that side of the equation is actually the source of so much meaning. It's the source of it does such better justice to why is there anything at all? Like, what is this strange thing that we're participating in, And so for me, it's more philosophically satisfying. It's more ethically satisfying, in terms of my own kind of moral compass. It does better justice to life, and yet I sometimes feel like I need a little bit of that transcendent impulse, cessative at certain moments too.
I think at different
let the world go to hell,
But I think at different moments in one's life, a bit like what you're saying with being a scholar practitioner, that you have your natural bias, but also one oscillates between them through your life. And it's like when you're kind of veering off a little bit too far into the immanence, the transcendence pulls you back. I love this polarity theory where each polarity trues up the other. It's a bit like riding a bike, where you feel yourself falling a little bit to the left, and the right, will pull you back, and you're kind of what you're aiming for. And again, this is a terminology thing that I like. I prefer harmony than balance. I think balance, harmony has a kind of a generative quality to it, that it creates like a harmonic resonances that stack up, and expand outwards, whereas balance is a kind of like slightly static word.
I appreciate that.
But I'm just conscious we're just running out of time, and I've loved this conversation. It's everything I hoped it would be. That just, if you please could just say a little bit how you think Tantra has evolved, since it emerged roughly around the 5th century CE, that kind of time, to now. What are some of the interesting innovations that have happened, that you think are kind of positive and beneficial?
Well, I mentioned this this kind of shift from more dualistic and ritualistic forms of Tantra to modalities that are more non-dual in their orientation, and also that actually corresponds with a really important process, sometimes described as like the internalization of the deities and the internalization of the rituals, where the outer rituals become paradigms for inner awareness practices, sometimes following their structure or sometimes just focusing on immediacy and spontaneity. That happens in the Śaiva Tantras, and actually emerges out of the Shakti traditions under a turn called the Kaula turn. You could call it a turn as well within Tantra. And that, of course, the Kaulas will say this is an evolution, this is an innovation, right? And the non-Kaulas say those people are crazy. Right? All that stuff is like they've gone off the deep end, and they say that. Ramakanta critiques the Kaulas. My own perspective, because that Kaula turn is at the background and foundation of Abhinavagupta's writing, of works like the Shiva Sutra and the Vijnana Bhairava and the Spandakarika that we've come to know as the non-dual Shaivism of Kashmir, but also many other traditions like the Kubji-Ka tradition, goddess Kubji-Ka, which is a tradition where the chakra system that we're all familiar with first emerged, and which really emphasizes Kundalini as well. Also in the Sri Vidya tradition, which still flourishes in southern India today, where they worship the Sri Chakra. So all of these are informed from their very beginnings, with one exception, the Sri Vidya, by this turn. And it's a paradigm shift, and it opens up the audience is one of the things it does, because it starts to say things like, it starts to redefine even what a mantra is and even what initiation is. So instead of having to be kind of constricted by an institutional structure, but you're initiated into this and you have to repeat this mantra, it starts to say, no, what initiation truly is just awakening, right? And that's an internal event, not a ritual action. And what the mantra is basically an immersion in this kind of mantric level of awareness, right? Where there's like the potency of the power of speech in its most subtle form. And that's the power behind all mantras and all language. And so that's one major shift or development. And that happens around 8th to 9th century CE. But it really develops after that. And then there's an interesting distinction, I think, when Tantra between what happens with Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism and what happens with what we call Tantric Hinduism, forms of Hinduism. A lot of the traditions that I study in great depth, they become discontinued. And a lot of the aspects of them become diffuse. They kind of diffuse into, other, like into Vedanta, interestingly. Like if you look at the Vedantic monasteries, they do tantric practices into Brahminical traditions, right? You see, like even my wife's uncle, their family, he's like a Brahmin in the kind of Brahminical Vedic tradition. And when he does worship, he's doing nyasa, he's like installing deities into mandalas, and it's all based on the Veda.
Yeah.
So there's this diffusion. And there's a few traditions that do continue unbrokenly, but they develop a lot in different ways. One is the Shaiva Siddhanta, the dualistic tradition. It becomes much more temple-based. And then the other is the Sri Vidya tradition, and it actually becomes more routinized. And although there's, kulas or communities where they continue the more esoteric aspects and teachings and non-dual teachings that are truer to the Kaula roots. And so the distinction between those in Tantric Buddhism is that because Buddhism went to Tibet, through the auspices of these waves of transmission, the second one being through Padmasambhava, and you have the institutional continuity of these 4 Tibetan schools of Tibetan Buddhism. You have all of the texts and practices untouched. And all of the modes of transmission, of course they change in time, right? But you actually have the full tantric infrastructure, right? And when I actually go to Tibetan monasteries, and I've spent some time in them in India, for example, I'm like jealous because it's exquisite. Now, even within Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, you have like the monastics and the yogis, right? Like there's these great tensions between Milarepa and Longchenpa, right? And going back to that lineage, who are like these wilderness yogis, right? And these siddhas who then like come down and they make fun of all the monks who are just, good monastics following what the abbot says, right? And there's this like interplay and between like really esoteric yogi practices and then more like, structured monastic cultures, and each school is different. All that's to say, in terms of evolution, my experience is that what happened when Abhinavagupta was writing was like, it's like a high point in tantric civilization, right? And in fact, what I see on offer in Hindu tantra communities is like nowhere close to as sophisticated or as, just because it's not is supported, right? It was incredibly supported. It was like an efflorescence of culture and in philosophy, the sophistication of which, give me an example, recognition sutras, right? That text seems very difficult for people who are new to this tradition. It's a very technical work and it's hard to understand. You have to read it many times, right? In the context of Kshemaraja, who wrote that text, he wrote that for people who cannot understand, right?
Yeah.
Like the actual Ishvara Pratyabhijna Karika. He's like, that's right. So that was the easy text. That was the primer. I think Torella calls it a catechism, right? That's like the manual for schoolboys or girls, right? The real stuff, which I read, I work on that, the Ishvara Pratibhyakarika in its commentaries. I've been working on them for a while.
Yeah.
That is like that level of tantric philosophy I do not see in today's discourse at all. There's like scholars working on it, right? But and in terms of living tradition, so I hope that's not a sad note, but I gotta be honest. I got to be honest with you.
So you're talking a kind of a devolution, but
I'm talking devolution here.
Yeah, but I think it's the diffusion that you were talking about is interesting. How you kind of notice some of this tantric philosophy cropping up in areas totally unrelated, where it's almost like it's kind of say Tibetan Buddhism, which is essentially a sort of tantric, it had tantric roots, and that has informed the culture. I mean, say Star Wars, for example, it's very much I don't know whether explicitly, but you watch Star Wars and it's
did you know the Ewoks are speaking Tibetan and
are they?
Yeah.
Wow. No, I didn't know that, but but I know it's not that kind of the high point of philosophy you're talking about. It's not necessarily that, but the kind of flavor of Tantra, via Tibetan Buddhism and other means has actually kind of seeped into our culture in a way. And it's just every now and again, you kind of notice it pop up in certain bits of, movies and those kind of things. And yeah, I don't know.
No, I do think the diffusion's interesting, and one could describe it as like a tantric flavor that you can experience in certain communities and certain teachings, and it's a part of the impact of this tantric world. And Tibetan Buddhism, and again, we shouldn't think of tantra just it's not just Śaiva Tantra or Jain Tantra. Right? Jain Tantric traditions are also still alive, So I think we can speak about its development in two different ways. One is like the way it's impacted things like genetically, but not within its kind of coherent initial integrity. And then actual institutional tantric traditions that are thoroughly tantric, right? Through and through. And their continued life, right? But maybe I can say something really kind of interesting at this point. This is kind of a nicer note to end on. So I'm reading this text. I'm working on this South Indian scholar who wrote a hymn, not to the deity, but to Abhinavagupta. So we could say it's a guru stotra, right? He's praising Abhinavagupta. And there's a lot of speculation. His name's Madhuraja, and he's in Tamil Nadu, and he's after Abhinavagupta. There was speculation that he met Abhinavagupta in person, and he writes this beautiful visualization of Abhinavagupta, and it's described by a scholar as a pen picture. And all of the artistic representations we see of Abhinavagupta are based on this text. But no one read the rest of his text, and he actually wrote a few other texts as well, and I've been working on them. And what my articles that's forthcoming, I got to finish it first, is arguing, is that first of all, the question of whether he met him or not is not that important. But I'm pretty sure, and I think I proved this really clearly, that he did not meet him in person. But he had this relationship to his texts and to his mind, right? And he describes, in fact, the ways that Abhinavagupta's speech and his eloquence, like his consciousness through the vehicle of his speech, has saturated his mind and his heart and awakened him completely. Now, that happened without having to actually physically meet the master, right? That happen through a non-institutional mode of transmission. What I further show is that Abhinavagupta sets the dice, right? He realizes that the transmission of a tradition based on kind of enlightened minds transmitting their minds to others is very tenuous, because there could be breaks in the tradition and you don't have an institutional structure to hold it up, right?
Yeah.
But he's aware that even with those breaks, at any time, that enlightened mind can reemerge, right? Even from something as simple as studying the words of an enlightened teacher, right? And Madhuraja Yogin is this fascinating example of that. I mean, he speaks about his own realization in first person terms, right? And it's really the kind of reenactment of the same awakening process that happened within Abhinavagupta. And so what these texts start to track is like, what are the causes and conditions, or like, what are the ideal conditions where that can not only emerge, but be sustained in human communities? And there's this possibility that it doesn't require all of these outer structures. In fact, that it's because the nature of consciousness is just that, because of that singular fact you were talking about, right? That trumps everything, right? There's no external thing that needs to be arranged for that to shine forth, right? And that happens through grace, you know? And so you can have, this is important for us because it means we can have a relationship to the mind and heart of Abhinavagupta that can be incredibly illuminating. And that's been my experience of studying him for 10 years as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a bit more hopeful. And it's like, you know, it's an evolution that there's this, that people like you and Christopher Wallace are doing these really in-depth translations into English, which is being your first language, which is kind of the lingua franca sort of a lot of the, you know, most of the world. And then they're being translated into other languages. So, you know, for the first time ever, these tantric texts and the original literature is actually available all over the world to anybody who has an internet connection or a postal address to get a paperback book or whatever. You know, so that is pretty amazing. And as you say, that actually touches Abhinavagupta and those authors, that they penned those words, and that created an unbroken causal chain to you reading those words. It's one seamless event. You know, that's amazing. Yeah, what a great place to end. And so just thank you so much for your time. This has just been a really wonderful conversation. And before we finish, where would people go to find out more about your work or anything you care about?
Well, you know, I have a faculty page at Naropa University, and I also have a Patreon where my colleague James Reich and I translate Sanskrit texts. So if you could share that link in the notes. We basically, it's called Close Readings, and we just take people through texts. We go into a lot of the Krama texts that I was describing and so far, and actually we studied that philosophical work, which was the source for the Recognition Sutras as well. We go through an entire chapter with a commentary and dive deep into that. So that's been a really fun side project that I've been a part of. So
cool.
Yeah, those would be the main places to connect.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. I so appreciate it. Really generous of you to get to do this, and may it benefit many people. And may many people find your work and connect with this amazing literature and connect back to the high point. Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation and the hospitality.
Yeah. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. Lots of love. I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile